independence, India did become a federal state, and all of us probably recall the early worries that this greatly diverse and heterogeneous country might sort of drift apart and be subject to the centrifugal tendencies at the time. Luckily, the political system proved sufficiently resilient and adaptable to weather these problems. The political development turned out to be reasonably stable, much more so than in Pakistan. Netaji's belief that the Congress should continue as a party with democratic procedures in free India, but other parties should exist, was also carried out with reasonable success. The country managed even through regional parties and new parties emerging. Another important factor was the maintenance of a by and large secular state. India in its diversity could not have continued in any other way, and the Supreme Court lately seems to support the view that secularism is of relevance, and I personally concur with that very strongly. Now, the optimal mix of public and private responsibility in an economy were originally weighted more in favor of the public in India. While Netaji would have advocated such an approach, we do not know whether he, and for that matter Pandit Nehru, would have seen the disadvantages earlier than the politician of the 1980s and 1990s did. Eventually, India was more or less forced into liberalization in the 1990s, because otherwise the economy would have collapsed. We have to recognize that this process was accompanied by the typical pros and cons: economic growth and rising incomes for a growing middle class, better job opportunities for some, better prospects for innovation and business opportunities. But on the negative side of the ledger, we find that the society drifts apart in such a process, and the income distribution becomes less equitable. There are pockets or large areas of poverty which take a long time, if ever, to get out of their miserable state. We can be certain that Netaji would not have envisaged that poverty, illiteracy and ill health would improve at such a slow rate, leave alone not be eradicated by today. On a critical note, we may argue that China was more successful in that way, but was it really, or does it have a more successful propaganda? On a more realistic note, we may also say that we have learned that enforcing social change unfortunately takes much longer than we would wish for. In spite of a fair track record in many walks of life in India, there continue to be lots of problems, and I could outline a long list. I just want to mention 6 in very brief form. One is economic growth is necessary with a strongly growing population, but I think today we also know of the dangers of economic growth. That means economic growth has to be ensured with a greater responsibility for environmental effects, and I believe India has signed the Paris Agreement on that. Resources have to be found in order to be able to finance the general education of the masses. And we can hope what we wish, but we have to accept that these resources to a large part will come out of the heights of the middle class. Otherwise, in tax revenue, you don't get a large enough tax base for that, and that of course means a tax burden on the middle class. What the new tax, goods and service tax in India will mean in that sense, we could speculate about, but that would go beyond my topic today. A further inroad has to be made on the improvement of public health, but that doesn't only mean investing more in the traditional healthcare system. I think more than anything it means investing in hygiene and the environment. clean water should be a must for everyone. And to quote the present Prime Minister, Mr. Modi, first the toilets and then the temples. A true emancipation of women, I think, which already my father called for, I think is of the utmost importance. And to quote my father, if you educate a man, you educate one person. If you educate a woman, you educate a whole family. I want to point out one thing which may not be that obvious for people who do not deal with demography. If you look at the Indian composition of the population, you find that more than 50% are men and less are women. And that is very unusual. It doesn't happen by chance because women's life expectancy is higher than men's life expectancy. It means simply that female children are killed when they are little or aborted, which is also not legal, but this is a terrible thing to have to say about a country like India. It's not confined to India. Bangladesh and Pakistan has more or less the same situation there. Probably some other countries too. While many Indians and Pakistanis should unfortunately already, when their countries were born, so to say, that religious tolerance was not always upheld. This continues to be a problem. And we can only hope that people will become more tolerant of each other. Somehow, many of these things are interacting, and I'm afraid that unless economic growth and general well-being can be achieved for the majority of the people, it becomes all the more difficult because you have more sense of envy and ill will if people really are very poor. And the last point, when I met the former Prime Minister Manmohan Singh, he asked me what I would consider the most pressing problem for India, and I answered him eradicating corruption. While I'm convinced of this being one of the most crippling problems of India's economy, I must confess that I do not have the faintest idea how one could go about achieving it. No doubt a degree of corruption exists everywhere, but the extent that some countries of the world, and those of the Indian subcontinent among them, have to contend with are truly crippling. Like a cancer, corruption sort of kills society and kills the economy. And I cannot help being very sad to imagine what the freedom fighters of my father's generation would think if they knew what has become of their beloved country in that respect. Thank you very much. Jai Hind.
Ladies and gentlemen, we'll take just a few questions, very few, because I think we must get down to dinner. So we have a group of media people here. So if you have a question, please, you have first go on it. Yes, Danish, yes.
Thank you very much for coming here and giving this lecture. Of course, my question is again about the whole talk about Subash Chandra Bose's death and the whole narrative that's behind it. Why do you think this is an issue that has divided the country and also Netaji's family itself?
His death, you mean?
Yeah.
Well, let me try to answer it that way. In 1945, we were at the end of a worldwide war. We had a communication system which differed radically from the one we have today, where within minutes, seconds, news travels around the world. I still recall my mother trying to send a letter to my uncle, and she got lost on the way, and then she sent it again. And she said, well, now a letter by airmail is possible. Just to give you an idea what the communication system of the time was. Many of them, like my mother, heard on the radio that my father was killed in a plane crash. And many people thought, well, first of all, his close relatives, like his brother, like my mother, were totally devastated. I think my mother would have committed suicide if she hadn't had the responsibility. And for my uncle, it was also absolutely terrible. And in a way, it was sort of clinging to the idea, oh, he got away so often under very adventurous circumstances, maybe he got away again. And so in the beginning, many documents which became available later on were not available. So it was this hope and speculation which sort of upheld them. And my uncle Charles died in 1950. And when he died, the situation was still such that it wasn't certain what happened at the time. Then later on, documents became available after 30 years. Inquiry commission was set up in 1956, in 1979 again, and another one in 2000. No, towards the end of the 1990s, 98, I think. The two previous inquiry commissions came to the conclusion that he died in a plane crash. Recent documents released by the Japanese government essentially supported the same thing. Other documents did too. At the same time, given the life that my father had had, which was very unusual, all sorts of stories popped up. Sometimes crazy stories, like I talked to one person who was mistaken for my father. He's 2 meters tall, he was Austrian by origin, but he was a Hindu monk. And people used to tell him, oh, aren't you Netaji? I said, look here, I'm 8 inches taller than he was. How can I be Netaji? Oh, that would be no problem for Netaji at all to grow another 8 inches. Now, what do you say to such a thing? And I must say, for me, the most sort of first convincing thing to accept the report on the plane crash was when I was present in the interview of one of the other survivors of that plane crash, when Professor Gordon, who is a biographer of my father and my auntie, interviewed this gentleman, a Japanese officer in Japan. And this sounded thoroughly convincing, and reading through the documents, which meanwhile have become available, which more or less tell the same story, this is the only consistent story about his life. If you start with some idiotic story like Gumnami Baba is Netaji, apart from all other things that it is stupid, and I mean people are stupid very often, it is an insult to Netaji. Just imagine this man who has sacrificed so much for his country would come back and live possibly in rather questionable circumstances also in a place in Uttar Pradesh. It just makes no sense at all. He would not contact anyone in his family, he would not contact other friends, he would resist from involving himself, even making a statement about affairs. It just makes no sense. And other things, okay, you may speculate, might have been a bit less unrealistic, but to me this is the only one, and some of my relatives have other views. It's a free world.
Okay. Any other question?
Could I ask something?
Yes, okay. Yes, gender equality, yes.
I hope so.
Evening, ma'am. Thanks a lot for coming here. What I would have wanted to ask you was actually how was he as a dad, but since you spent only 4 weeks of your life with him, I don't think you can answer that. What I would want to know is how has having a dad like him has it made you, and like any changes in your life? Having a dad like him and iconic figure.
Well, let me start with one aspect in my generation.
The question is, in case you didn't hear it at the back, is that did it make a difference to have an iconic dad like Subhash Bose?
To grow up without a dad in my generation was not unusual because so many fathers were killed as soldiers. Later on, many marriages fell apart and very often the fathers got lost in that process. So that was a more or less normal thing. To have an iconic dad, of course, is difficult. It also depends how it's handled. And my mother was always a person who was sort of very strict in that point. She said, well, your father may be a great person, but it doesn't make you a great person at all. If anything, it places a responsibility on you. And I think this is a good way to handle it, but admittedly not everybody does it that way. So in a way it is a bit, how should I say, well, it makes you a bit unsecure of yourself. You say, I certainly can't live up to that. But I mean, there are so many people whose image we cannot live up to. Maybe if it's a father, it's a bit closer to home, but ultimately as you grow older, I think you have to find the security to be yourself, and whoever your parents may be, good or bad, it's yourself that counts and not what members of your family are. I think you don't derive a blame and you don't derive a credit from that, essentially.
Thank you very much. I think we leave it there. And we must hear from the High Commissioner.
I planned the eulogy for Netaji not only because I'm the High Commissioner, because I'm a student of history, but Professor Pfaff, I hope I've got your name right. My special assistant learned German in Frankfurt, and she said it's Pfaff with a silent P. So it was wonderful hearing you, and you are the daughter of an iconic figure, someone all of us have read about. Unfortunately, I was born a generation later, but the exploits of the INA, imagine if the Battle of Kohima had turned out differently and the INA Japanese army combined had won, what would have happened to India? These are questions in history we won't go into, but all I wanted to say was, of course he's an iconic leader. If the Britain hadn't been varied by World War II, would they have left, and would non-violence have succeeded? These are questions that obviously we don't have an answer because they're hypothetical. But one person from the INA, I've only met one person from the INA, and he was a very senior colleague in the Foreign Service later, Colonel Mehboob Ahmed. Colonel Mehboob Ahmed was the military secretary to Netaji. He joined the British Indian Army, and then he was in the Frontier Force, and then he defected to the INA during World War II, and he was imprisoned. And Colonel Mehboob Ahmed came from Patna, which is my hometown. Our families knew each other for 3 or 4 generations. And when I was in boarding school, his son was a year junior to me, and I did a very good bargain. Perhaps I should have been a businessman, a trader. I traded 1 tin of sardines for a tin of Kraft cheese. Now, a tin of sardines was easily available in the canteen those days, and a tin of Kraft cheese you couldn't get anywhere, except smuggled from Australia, I believe, those days. And Imran, his son, still remembers that, and we correspond on email once in a few months, and he always reminds me of what hard bargain I drove. But Colonel Mehboob Ahmed, of course, was a legendary figure, and so much that when he was imprisoned by the Japanese, in fact, my father fought World War II. He fought with the Indian Army at that time, the Chindits in Burma in 44-45. But he met Colonel Mehboob Ahmed in the Insean prison in Rangoon in 1946. And despite all the humiliations and the tribulations that he underwent, he remained fiercely patriotic. And while he was not absorbed in the Indian Army after our independence, he was given an appointment in the Indian Foreign Service, and he later rose to be an ambassador in Indonesia, if I remember, the Netherlands, and he was also chief of protocol, a legendary figure. And if you Google him, those of you Colonel Mehboob Ahmed, you will get his life history, not very easily, but you can. But Netaji obviously inspired people like that. And you of course have heard of Sehgal and Dhillon and Shahnawaz Khan. Shahnawaz Khan of course became minister in the Congress government later on. And many people from the INA did extremely well later on after independence. But you're right, Professor Faf, perhaps we didn't recognize them the way we should have, not early enough in any case, because they certainly fought for the independence of India. And what Netaji did inspired generations of people. And I think when I walked in, and that's why Ashish punished me, he said I should speak after dinner because I was late. But Ashish was talking about Auchinleck. Now, Field Marshal Auchinleck actually wrote a letter, and I have that quote, it's lying in my car. But he wrote a letter to Lord Wavell saying that we cannot rely on the loyalty of the British Indian Army because they have been infused with nationalism, and in fact most Indians have been, and we can't rely on them. So it's very difficult to, especially after the naval mutiny in '46 and the Jabalpur mutiny, very difficult to hold on to their loyalty. And people believe Auchinleck, who was the CNC, the Field Marshal, his views counted, and the government realized, the British government realized that despite their divide and rule policy, they would have to leave Britain. One last thought, of course, now they're complaining of divide and rule in Brexit, but anyway. The one last thought, what if, again, the Battle of Kohima had been won and the INA would have marched along with the Japanese army triumphantly? This is not to ignore the grave human rights violations committed by the Japanese army in occupied territories in Southeast Asia. But with the INA and Netaji at its lead, if they had won the war and come to India, people ask, would British colonialism or imperialism be supplanted with Japanese imperialism? Again, that's a question that nobody knows, won't answer. But one thing is clear, that if Netaji had won, or the INA had won, perhaps history would have been different. Because Netaji was a very strong leader, a leader who inspired people more than anyone else. And yet, don't forget that he was the first person, if I remember correctly, who coined the word father of the nation for Mahatma Gandhi. Even though Mahatma Gandhi was instrumental in easing him out of the presidentship of the Congress because of differences of view. So Netaji was not only patriotic, but he was very loyal and very disciplined. And I think the example that he has set for all of us, and is something that, I mean, we obviously all want to emulate, but I don't think we can really. But even if we aspire to, I think he would remain an icon for generations to come. But just one last point, if I may. Just this morning, I was at a conference by Chatham House, and there was a discussion where our Minister of State, N.J. Akbar, was a participant in the panel. And there was a study called Edelman's Trust Barometer, done for 28 countries. And 28 countries, 33,000 people polled, and India was one of them. And there were 4 institutions, and the people polled were asked to rate whether they trust them or not. The government, the business, the media, and the NGOs. And I was quite surprised, frankly, because all 4, government I could understand, but the other 3, pardon my, I know the media is here in large numbers, but India was the only country which the people polled expressed faith or trust in all the 4 institutions in their countries, which was truly remarkable. Professor Faf mentioned about corruption, and I'm sure you're aware of what the government has done about corruption. you have a prime minister who is incorruptible. He doesn't have a family. Or like that. And he has taken initiative that his predecessors didn't. And not only that, he has not just corruption, he has taken on a missionary zeal clean India. He has taken on a missionary zeal many things. Now, I think the media here unfortunately doesn't recognize that. So be it. I think that the time has come that we recognize what we are. And when you compare what we were 70 years ago and what we are today, and compare what our neighbor was 70 years and what we are today, my question is answered. Thank you very much.